Hi, and welcome to the Ministry Network podcast. I'm your host, James Baird. Today, we'll talk with Dr. Stephen J. Nichols. Dr. Nichols is a teaching fellow and chief academic officer at Ligonier Ministries and the president of Reformation Bible College. Dr. Nichols is also a distinguished graduate of Westminster Theological Seminary. We'll talk with him about leadership and Martin Luther. The Ministry Network podcast is sponsored by Westminster Theological Seminary. To learn more about their new online degree programs, visit ministrynetwork.com/degree. Now, let's talk with Dr. Nichols. Dr. Nichols, thank you so much for joining us here on Ministry Network.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be with you, James. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it is all our pleasure. We are so excited today to talk about leadership and to talk about Luther. To open us up, Dr. Nichols, can you tell us a little bit about your journey into academic theology, including your education? We would just love to hear especially about your time at Westminster.
Yeah, well, I can tell you about my time at Westminster by telling you about my first semester of teaching. So my first semester of teaching, I had 253 students. I had 5 courses. This is college. I had 5 courses and 4 preps. So only one of those courses had, 2 sections. It was hermeneutics, introduction to Western philosophy, doctrine of God, and 2 sections of doctrine of Christ. And of course, I come into these classes with empty file folders to teach. I'm barely keeping a day ahead. I barely made it through. I would not have made it through had it not been for my Westminster education. And it was not just that first year. I have drawn on my Westminster education ever since I was at that place. And while I was at Westminster, I was involved in a local church. I was teaching Sunday school. And since then, been involved in teaching, trying to serve the church. And I have nothing but gratitude for the time that I was at Westminster. So grateful. For one, for all the books that I've had to read. So I think of this foundation of, I don't know, 500 books maybe that I had to really slog through between the master's and the PhD. I draw upon that all the time. And not just that, but the faculty. And I think of the impact they had on me. I was able to work at the bookstore while I was at Westminster as a student. So the faculty, of course, love being in the bookstore, so that just afforded opportunities for me to hear Sinclair Ferguson tell Scottish jokes and and just be around these delightful men of God. I'd always held Westminster up on a pedestal, and the years that I spent there were just delightful years. So very grateful for it.
Well, we're thankful for alum like you.
Well, it's a wonderful place, and I'm really glad that it's a part of who I am.
So you have a lot of experience as a teacher and professor, and now you're a college president. Can you tell us a little bit about your decision to make that transition?
Yeah, it was not an easy one. I really enjoyed the classroom, and I enjoyed writing, and I also enjoyed freedom of my schedule. And so pretty much all 3 of those things went out the window as I became president. We've managed to get some of the writing back in. I do teach a course, but of course now my schedule does not belong to me, which is fine. But the main reason I did it was because of this place, Reformation Bible College, Ligonier Ministries. But the college, it was really wet cement when I came here. It was in its 4th year, which for higher education years, that's still infancy. So I just saw a place that I love the curriculum. I love the philosophy. The opportunity to be with Dr. Sproul and what would be his twilight years, all of those were just reasons why this felt like something I could just roll up my sleeves and get behind and be a part of. So on the one hand, yes, it was a difficult decision. On the other hand, it wasn't hard at all.
Can you tell us a little bit about Dr. Sprouls' vision for RBC?
Yeah, in some ways it goes back to what he was trying to do at the study center. And the study center was sort of an end run around the establishment. He was part of that Presbyterian culture of Pittsburgh that was the epicenter of American Presbyterianism, but was fading and drifting, and he saw it. He had his own college and seminary education, were both at incredibly liberal institutions. He was fortunate as an undergrad to have a Westminster Seminary faculty member And that was a huge influence on R.C. It's what convinced R.C. to study philosophy. He'd say that made the difference in his life. But back to RBC, when he started the study center in the Ligonier Valley there in western Pennsylvania, it was life-on-life discipleship. And it was a little bit like L'Abri. People went there. But it was very different from L'Abri. It wasn't evangelism. It was theological education. And it was intense. In fact, it was so intense that a year into this, colleges across western PA and into Ohio are granting college credit for kids to go there and study over the winter. So at one point, 14 colleges were offering credit for Ligonier Study Center classes. So we fast forward to 2011, and what we see is an almost back to the roots moment. Ligonier had grown to a national ministry, largely a tape or teaching ministry. But this was a chance to get back to that life-on-life discipleship. That was his vision. Related to this was also his vision of his love for the reformers. We're going to talk about Luther here in a minute. His love for the reformers, and one of the things he realized was how invested they were in educating the next generation. And so I think this desire to get back to teaching college students was always there. But that, especially that celebration around Calvin in 2009 in Geneva, and it just became part of what R.C. wanted to do. So next thing you know, he opens the doors for Reformation Bible College.
You've done some significant work on Luther, not the least significant of which is The Legacy of Luther, which you and Dr. Sproul co-edited. And you've also done some work on leadership, and leadership as it relates to Luther. Can you briefly give us a sketch of Luther's biography and the context that led up to his leadership of what would become the Reformation?
That's a very tall order, James. We're talking about one of the most monumental lives in all of Western history, and you're asking for a brief. So,
if anyone can do it, it's you.
Yeah, here we go. Well, he was born, and we'll go year by year. He was born in 1483. There's a couple pivotal moments in Luther's life. He studied law, Erfurt, 1501 to 1505. At 1505, there's the famous thunderstorm, and it represents all that angst side of Luther. He was a terribly troubled soul, deeply troubled soul, and he felt as if God was out to get him at every turn. And the thunderstorm was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, and he makes a deal in the midst of this that he'll give up everything, right, and go into the monastery if God spares his life. Well, as Roland Bainton says, God kept his end of the bargain, and so Luther kept his. Of course, we know it doesn't work that way, but it's a great story. So he goes into the monastery at Erfurt, and a couple things happen here. For the first time, Luther sees a Bible. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? To be a Christian your whole life, to be in a Christian church your whole life, and never have a Bible. That shows us where the church was at the beginning of the 16th century. That it's not until years into being a monk that for the first time he holds a Bible. The other thing, of course, is the trip to Rome, and that signals his utter disillusionment. Meanwhile, back in Wittenberg, Frederick the Wise is trying to apply his tremendous energy and wealth to establishing a fine university in Europe that was really an upstart college at Wittenberg. And he had heard about this bright young monk, and so he brings him to Wittenberg to teach. And Luther's teaching all the right books. He's teaching Galatians and Hebrews and Psalms and Romans. And he's reading Augustine, and eventually the truth will out. And that's what happens for Luther. And we have the wonderful discovery, and of course, we've got the pivotal moment of posting the 95 Theses, which begins this big debate, and it really ends in 1521, where he's excommunicated and brought to the Diet at Worms, and he makes his famous "Here I Stand" speech. He's exiled off to the Wartburg, makes his triumphal return to Wittenberg, and the rest is history. But the thing I like to point out sometimes is Luther goes on to live until 1547. And not only is he the visionary, but he also spends several decades helping to establish the church and see it get in its right footing. The other thing is we see Luther get old. We see his frailty. We see him suffering. He writes at the end of how I'm a one-eyed, so he probably had cataracts, I'm a one-eyed, sick, old man. And he's just weary. So that's his life. It's interesting. Probably one of the most influential people in the history of Western culture. He only left Germany once to Rome. That was it. And to think about from that base, mostly at Wittenberg, of what God did through Luther. It's amazing.
I'll add an applause track for that ability to summarize everything in that way. That was incredible.
I skipped a lot.
Yeah. This is where you say, you'll have to buy my book.
It's all in the book.
That's right. Well, Luther was someone who has amazing strengths and fascinating weaknesses at the same time. So let's start with the strengths. Can you walk us through what were some of the aspects of his leadership style that you find most helpful, and give some examples?
Yeah, so I appreciate this conversation about Luther. Can I just start there? Because we think of Luther, the biblical scholar, Luther, the reformer, Luther, the churchman. He also led one of history's biggest movements. So, we have all these leadership gurus. Well, let's look at Luther. So a couple strengths. One that strikes me is, and this is what we think of when we think of Luther, his boldness, his courage. And the interesting thing is, this, of course, was a boldness and courage that came from without. To use Luther's Latin expression, extra nos. Just as righteousness is outside of us, boldness is extra nos. Because internally, Luther had fear. He had fear of God. And I don't mean godly fear. I mean like quaking in his boots fear until he was converted. He feared the Pope. He feared that he was wrong. No, he didn't fear the Pope for long. So that's true. But initially he did. And initially he would really wrestle with, what if I'm wrong? He had decisions that he had to make every day that impacted thousands of lives. And he had a lot of self-doubt and fear. But he was able to have his confidence in God. And of course, we see this in A Mighty Fortress is Our God. It's the bulwark that's never failing. It's dost ask who that may be. That little word, right? That one word that will conquer all our enemies is Jesus Christ. And so what can Luther say? The body they may kill, right? And that's not hyperbole. We talk that way, it's hyperbole. Luther, he's serious. God's word abideth still. So his confidence was in God. His confidence was in Christ. His confidence was in the word of God. And that's, leaders need that. We question ourselves. We have to make decisions. We have pressures. We have unknowns and uncertainties. This season we are in has highlighted the perplexities that we have to deal with. I don't know exactly what we're going to be doing in mid-August. We're planning, we're hoping, who knows what's going to happen between now and mid-August. So, when you look at all of that, the institutions that are led, be they churches or schools or ministries, the people that are led, they need a leader that can say, let's take that hill because God has told us to take that hill and God is with us. And so that's one. Definitely boldness. I think another strength is just perseverance, that slogging through it. He suffered, he lost a daughter, he lost a son in infancy, he lost friends. He had whole people turn, peasants' war. Initially, the peasants are for him, and Luther counsels them not to break the law and take a life, and they break the law and take lives, and so he thinks they turn against them. The princes think he's with them. They think he turns against them. So he comes out of the peasants' war sort of losing on both ends. So he had a lot of hardship, a lot of difficulty. He just slogged through it. He just persevered. And through all those personal struggles, and same for leadership, you've got to just keep pushing forward, keep the vision in front of you, keep the troops rallied, and persevere, knowing that this is the right path to be on and that there's something of eternal value here that we're working for. We can endure this. James, we've talked about this before, the resilience piece. Isn't this really what it is? It's that resilience, and it's a lost quality today, a lost character trait. So Luther had it. There's no doubt.
On the flip side, what were some of Luther's greatest weaknesses as a leader? And can you give some examples?
Yeah, sure. It's the old boomerang of our strengths become our weaknesses. Luther's boldness can become brashness and a lack of level-headed calmness. And sometimes that resulted in a vitriolic speech, in fact, more often than not. And, everyone draws attention to Luther's remarks against the Jews. The reality is he was an equal opportunity offender. He had mean things to say about the Jews. He had mean things to say about the Catholics. He had mean things to say about the Anabaptists. He had mean things to say about his fellow Lutherans. He had mean things to say about his fellow Reformers. He had the meanest things to say about himself, but it's no excuse ultimately, and I do want to take it seriously. He had a brashness, and that brashness could manifest itself in not so gracious ways, both in terms of action and speech. And I do think it stemmed from his boldness, and that just never checked it. At one point, I think he makes the comment, Melanchthon cuts with the precision of a knife, and I just swing an axe. And sometimes you just need to swing the axe. But the reality is, it can get pretty messy, and wood chips are flying.
You lose a finger.
And you could lose a finger. Somebody else could lose a finger. So I'd say that's his legs of iron and feet of clay. And that's probably his Achilles heel there.
Now for the question I'm probably most excited about. What are your favorite apocryphal stories about Luther?
Hey, some of them actually are true. Like that, like you say, well, that can't be true. Turns out it is. Like everybody says, well, Luther is responsible for the Christmas tree. And you say, well, that's not true. No, actually it is true. They would put lights on trees outside. Luther is, from what we know, is one of the first to actually bring the tree inside.
Wow.
And light it, which is very dangerous because these are candles. And everything, is wood and a lot of books. But that's part of it. But there is the apocryphal stuff. There's debate about whether he actually posted the 95 Theses, whether they were just distributed or posted. There's debate if he ever said, "Here I stand," because it doesn't appear until later, and it appears in Latin, testimonials, etc. So there's your two pivotal moments, and I pray with all earnestness that they're true, because what would we do without them? But one of my favorite apocryphal stories is the whole, if Jesus were to come back tonight, what would you do today? And Luther's answer is, allegedly, I would plant an apple tree. There's no evidence that he was ever asked this question, and there's no evidence that he liked apple trees. And I'm not sure what the apple tree is. If he had said, I'd plant a field of yeast for the brewery, I would believe that.
Makes more sense than...
No, it'd make a lot more sense. I'd raise, hogs for meals, but I don't buy the apple tree thing. Luther would probably say, I've got one more book I'm dying to write, and I'm going to write it today. And he would finish it today and get it out. So the apocryphal Luther. I think there's a site out there somewhere that has collated all of these sayings that are attributed to Luther. So people can have fun tracking down the apocryphal Luther.
Do you happen to know what Dr. Sprouls' favorite Luther story would have been?
Well, there's three. So, it's a big life. You'll have to just choose one. You can't not talk about the Wittenberg door. Like, you just can't not talk about it. And it's, to him, that's one of his greatest places on the face of the earth. The other is Worms. And a couple occasions he was at both of these places. But when he was at Worms, he would always recite from memory the entire final speech of Luther the last day as he appeared before the Diet. But I think of all those moments in Luther's life, I think one that he really enjoyed was the last sermon that Luther preached at St. Mary's Church in Wittenberg, and then he ends up traveling back to his hometown of Eisleben, where he was born. That's where he ends up dying. But he preaches the final sermon, his final sermon was preached at Eisleben, but the final sermon he preached in Wittenberg. And he gets rumors about how his parishioners are going off to these pilgrimage sites and to these different cathedrals that have relics. And this just boggles Luther's mind. But he also sees Paul chastising the church at Galatia for countenancing false teachers. But it's in that sermon where Luther says, you put more stock in Joseph's pants than, the gospel. And the idea is that some cathedral had Joseph's clothes as a relic. R.C. loved that. And he would love to, Joseph's pants. Yeah. And so that was one of his stories. But it was a good story to him because it drove home the point, every generation needs the Reformation. You never say, we've got that covered, now let's move on. If it happened to Luther's church and it happened to Paul's church, don't think for a moment it can't happen in our church. So I think that's ultimately why RC loved that story.
Join us next time as we talk to Dr. Timothy Keller about his approach to preaching in New York City. In the meantime, visit ministrynetwork.com/degree to learn about the new online offerings available at Westminster Theological Seminary.